The year was 1941, and for the German soldiers everything seemed to be going as the command had promised. Fast, brilliant, devastating. The immense Soviet plain stretched before them like an open invitation, and many believed that before Christmas they would already be toasting in Moscow. Propaganda said that the Soviet Union would crumble like a fragile house. And for a few months it really seemed that way. But nature, silent and patient, was preparing the cruelest blow of the entire campaign. At first it was just a different kind of chill, that wind that whipped at the nape of the neck and made men shrug their shoulders without realizing it. Autumn, however, did not slowly turn into winter. There was no smooth transition. It was as if someone had turned off the sun overnight. The trees were bare, the light lost its color, and the temperature plummeted like a blade falling from the sky. The ground, once thick clay, froze in a matter of hours. Stones, roots, wheel, tracks, everything disappeared under a layer of ice so hard that not even the tip of a shovel could scratch it. The soldiers stepped on it and felt the dry crack, as if walking on broken bones. The roads, once dusty trails, simply vanished, swallowed by white sheets that stretched as far as the eye could see. And then came the wind. It wasn't an ordinary wind. It was a cut, an invisible enemy that drew involuntary tears, cut the skin, and slipped inside clothes like icy fingers. It pierced coats, tore at courage, and made men tremble uncontrollably. Some tried to disguise it, laughed, made jokes, but behind the smiles was fear. Fear of something they had never faced before. The boots were beginning to stiffen. The metal of the helmets grew so cold it burned to the touch. Breath escaped their mouths like thick smoke, and each breath was a struggle against the freezing air. Some men woke during the night feeling suffocated, as if the cold were trying to enter their lungs and kill them from the inside. The truth, however, was not in the cold. It was in the silence, a heavy, different, almost supernatural silence, as if the front had stopped to observe the invaders with disdain. The younger ones, who had never seen a Russian winter, tried to convince themselves it was just a phase. The veterans, however, looked around with empty eyes. They had seen battles, explosions, blood, but nothing compared to that feeling that the very earth was preparing to devour an entire invading force. It was there in the first icy winds that many realized, even without admitting it, that something terrible, profound, and deadly was coming. Something bigger than bombs, bigger than tanks, bigger even than armies. The Russian winter was not coming. He invaded, like an ancient monster brutally bursting through the door, ready to devour everything in its path. The first warning that the situation was spiraling out of control didn't come from the soldiers, but from the machines. Tanks that weeks before had torn through Soviet soil like untamed beasts, now coughed, choked, and died like wounded animals. The panzers, the pride of Germany, symbols of speed and destruction, would wake up in the morning completely immobile, covered by a thin layer of ice that looked like a shroud. The mechanics did everything. They scraped away the frozen material with their fingernails, hammered it, and lit fires under the steel carcasses to try and warm the parts. Some soldiers even urinated on the engines, desperate to melt the ice that had accumulated in the pipes. But nothing seemed to work. The oil, thick as coagulated blood, simply froze. Imagine a war engine transformed into a cold statue. This is what thousands of soldiers saw when they woke up. And then came the most humiliating part. The Russians, accustomed to this white hell, started up their T-34 tanks as if it were a normal winter day. Their engines purred, ready to kill. The Germans watched this with a mixture of envy, anger, and fear. Feelings they were not used to experiencing. Infantry weapons also suffered. Mauser rifles jammed, MG-34 machine guns refused to fire. The metal contracted in the cold, and any drop of moisture turned into a crust of ice inside the mechanism. Soldiers banged the breech blocks on the ground to try to unjam them, but many weapons simply broke. The feeling of vulnerability was brutal. The trucks, essential for transporting food, ammunition and shelter, would stop in the middle of the frozen roads and never move again. Tires would tear, engines would roar one last time, and then they would die. When the wind blew strongly, the snow would accumulate around them so quickly that some vehicles would disappear from sight in a few hours, as if swallowed by the landscape. It was as if the front itself were shouting, "You don't belong here." In the midst of this silent chaos, the soldiers began to lose more than just weapons and machines. They lost hope. Each morning, more and more men woke, up with their toes purple and stiff. Gangrene was beginning to spread. Some had to cut the leather from their boots with knives because the ice had glued the skin to the fabric. You could hear muffled cries of pain in the camps as desperate doctors improvised treatments with what little they had. And the most terrifying thing, even the horses, those hardy animals, began to collapse, frozen amidst the columns. They fell slowly as if they were simply exhausted, and they never got up again. The men buried them in shallow trenches, but the earth was so hard that sometimes it just pushed snow over the bodies, creating small white mounds that marked their death. Each day, the German advance slowed, not because the enemy was strong, but because the climate. He was destroying everything without firing a single bullet. The message was clear. The Eastern Front was not a battle, it was a trial. And the Wehrmacht, which considered itself invincible, was beginning to realize that it was being crushed by something it could not kill, negotiate with, or intimidate. The Russian winter did not fight, he was executing. Initially, some soldiers were still trying to laugh at the situation. "It's just cold," they said. "We can handle it." But the Russian winter wasn't just cold. It was a primal, centuries-old, almost living force, and it was only beginning to show its claws. Temperatures plummeted, as if the sky had opened and dropped an icy abyss upon the earth. First 10 degrees, then 20 degrees. Within a few nights, the thermometer read 30 degrees C. And then, like a final blow no one expected, came 40 degrees C. A cold so profound it seemed to pierce the flesh and speak directly to the bones. Men found this out the hard way. Her fingers began to tingle. Then she lost all feeling. Next came sharp stabbing pains like needles being repeatedly driven in, until, suddenly, nothing. What was once pain turned to silence, a treacherous silence. That was how the White Death began. First stealing sensation, then stealing the body itself. In the makeshift camps, soldiers would wake up screaming when they realized the tip of their nose or ears had become stiff, almost like stone. Doctors would try to warm the extremities with lukewarm water, but sometimes it was too late. The skin would darken as if burned and begin to necrotize. The order was clear and cruel: cut to save the rest. Meanwhile, the wind seemed to take on a personality, an invisible wolf. It whistled through the trees, raced across the open field, and lashed against the tents as if it wanted to tear them apart. It was so cold it brought tears to their eyes, tears that froze before reaching their chins. Some soldiers reported that the wind seemed to push them backward, as if trying to stop their every step. Weapons, blankets, backpacks, everything was covered in a layer of ice within minutes. Clothes didn't keep them warm, and sweat, when it appeared, betrayed the soldier. A little moisture was enough for the clothes to stick to the skin like a frozen trap. Many discovered that after walking for long periods, the vapor from their own breath froze inside the collar of their coats, forming a rigid crust that hurt their necks. But the worst, the most terrible thing, was the silence that took over the marches. No birds, no animals, no sound of running water, only the dry crunch of snow under boots and sometimes the sound of a soldier falling and not getting up again. The rescue teams couldn't reach everyone. Men were found, standing, leaning against trees, frozen in the position they had stopped to rest, like human statues lost in time. All it took was closing their eyes for a few minutes for death to arrive, peaceful, silent, and final. The worst moments came at night, When the wind picked up and the temperature dropped even further, the entire camp trembled. The flames of the campfires struggled to stay alive, flickering as if they too were afraid. Soldiers huddled together inside the tents, trying to share a warmth, but sometimes they woke up next to a comrade who had not survived, and all this before the Red Army even attacked with full force. The Wehrmacht was beginning to understand that this war had two enemies, and the first, the most ruthless, the most constant, was not a Soviet soldier, nor a tank, nor a weapon. It was winter itself, an enemy who felt no pain. I didn't need to rest, and he was in no hurry to kill. Just when the Germans thought things couldn't get any worse, that the cold was already their worst enemy, something began to appear on the horizon. First, small dark shapes cutting through the white fog, then the distant echo of engines, and then the sound everyone feared, the roar of Soviet artillery. The Red Army was returning, and it wasn't the same retreating army from the summer. The Soviets had reorganized, rearmed, and most frighteningly, adapted to the winter as if it were an ally. They emerged wearing thick white coats that made them blend into the snow. They looked like ghosts, living shadows moving swiftly across the open countryside, while the Germans could barely feel their own feet. The vanguard of these reinforcements were the Siberian troops, soldiers trained from childhood to live in deadly temperatures. Men accustomed to hunting in blizzards, sleeping in ice caves, marching for miles without complaint. And now they were there, advancing with confidence while the Germans trembled. These Siberians moved with a light touch, as if the cold were part of their bodies. They ran, they threw themselves to the ground, they shot with deadly accuracy. For them, 40 degrees C was just another day. But for the Germans, it was torture. The first Soviet offensive came like a thunderclap. Artillery fired hundreds of projectiles at once. Explosions raised columns of snow and frozen earth, hurling chunks of ice like shards that cut faces and shredded uniforms. German soldiers tried to dig trenches, but the ground was as hard as stone. They ended up hiding behind tree trunks, abandoned cars, shallow holes, anything that offered temporary shelter. And as the sky exploded in red, the most terrifying sound of that campaign was heard, the cry of the advancing Soviet soldiers, a human chorus of hatred, fury, and determination. It was as if the earth itself was roaring against the invaders. Some Germans tried to fight back, but their weapons, frozen, failed at crucial moments. Machine guns jammed, ammunition exploded inside the clips because of the extreme cold. And when they finally managed to fire, the bullets sometimes strayed, affected by the thick, frigid air. On the other side, the Soviets fired their Mosin Nagant rifles as if they were in a military training exercise, without hesitation, without fear. The difference in preparation was stark. And then came the T-34s. Soviet tanks, with engines adapted for winter, emerged from clouds of kicked-up snow. Their engines purred with strength and confidence, while the German panzers, standing still and cold, looked like dead beasts. The T-34s advanced, crushing sandbags, shallow trenches, and sometimes even soldiers who couldn't escape in time. The Germans, now torn between panic and despair, retreated while trying to maintain some sort of formation. But the winter was unforgiving. Those who stumbled or fell found it difficult to get up. The cold robbed them of movement, froze wet clothes in seconds, and turned wounded men into statues before medics could arrive. And in the midst of the chaos, a terrible truth spread like a whisper. We are fighting two enemies, and one of them cannot be defeated. The Soviets knew this. Winter knew this. And the German soldiers, freezing and bleeding at the same time, began to feel something they had never felt before on the front lines: real fear, and the painful certainty that the war was changing. When the Soviets began to advance with full force, the Germans found themselves forced to transform. Small, rural villages, previously ignored on maps, these areas became veritable makeshift fortresses. Wooden houses, animal sheds, schools, and churches. Everything became shelter, a trench, or a point of resistance. These frozen villages were like islands of life in a cruel white ocean. And the fight for them was bloody. The windows were ripped out and replaced with sandbags hardened by the ice. Doors were reinforced with broken furniture. Soviet families who lived there had fled in haste, leaving behind cloths, toys, and utensils abandoned on the floor, now mixed with ammunition, shrapnel, and blood splatters. The German soldiers, exhausted, shivering, and starving, huddled inside the houses, trying to use the walls as a shield against the biting cold. Many had to rub their hands incessantly to keep their fingers alive. Others simply stamped their feet on the ground to prevent their bones from seeming to crack. But rest was impossible, because at any moment, the silence of winter was broken by the most terrifying sound, the echo of footsteps in the snow. The Soviets were coming. When the attack began, it was as if the entire village was engulfed in chaos. Soviet machine guns swept through the narrow streets. Snipers hidden on rooftops fired at any movement. Sometimes the enemy would appear so close that the German soldiers could see the enemy's hot breath turning into white vapor. The fight was hand-to-hand combat. The Germans used everything: frozen knives, rifle butts, shovels, bayonets, anything that could cut or crush. The interiors of the houses quickly filled with warm blood that ran down the wooden floors, creating stains that froze in minutes, hardening like red glass. Even when the Germans managed to repel an attack, the village remained a hellish place. The walls cracked from the impact of projectiles, windows shattered into pieces of ice, roofs collapsed under the weight of the accumulated snow. The smoke from the fireplaces, once a sign of comfort, now served as a denunciation of the German position, and the Soviets knew it. Every hour another group emerged, advancing through the trees, gliding silently across the snow, using the white as perfect camouflage. They approached like predators, slowly encircling the village without haste, because they knew the Germans were too weak to withstand multiple attacks. And something even more cruel was happening there. German soldiers were not only fighting the enemy, they were fighting with their own bodies. Rifles froze in the middle of a shootout. Numb fingers pressed triggers that wouldn't budge. Numb feet made every movement difficult. Each day the lodgings filled with men whose hands were wrapped in dirty rags, trying to hide black wounds caused by the cold. Doctors amputated fingers, hands, and feet with makeshift saws, without anesthesia, without time for lamenting. And the greatest tragedy lay in the growing realization that each village defended did not represent a victory, but rather an inevitable delay in a defeat that had been looming like a cold shadow. The Germans fought for pieces of land that didn't warm up, for walls that didn't protect, and for streets that led nowhere, only to snow, the enemy, and death. The truth was clear. They weren't defending villages. They were defending their own survival, and losing inch by inch. If at the beginning of the campaign the German soldiers marched with confidence, now they could barely put one foot in front of the other. Hunger, that silent enemy, began to attack with the same violence as winter, perhaps even worse, because it gnawed from within. The problem started slowly, like all tragedies that nobody wants to admit. First, the trucks carrying supplies were delayed. Then they stopped arriving. And finally, the field kitchens began serving smaller and smaller portions until the soldiers looked inside the mess tins as if they were empty windows. The bread, once soft, arrived as a hard block, impossible to bite, without breaking your teeth. The soup, thin and whitish, was heated in pots that froze before reaching the front lines. The fat coagulated so quickly that it formed a rigid film on the surface. Many soldiers broke that layer with their spoons, swallowing icy chunks that felt like stones in their stomachs. In some outposts, the only meal of the day was a piece of half-frozen potato and a sip of weak coffee that no longer tasted like anything. The smell of food had disappeared from the front lines, replaced by the acidic odor of unwashed bodies, wet clothes, infected wounds, and frozen sweat. Hunger transformed men. Those who were once disciplined scoured the village searching for any crumb. They tore open old sacks, rummaged through abandoned barns, broke down doors in search of forgotten grains. Some even went so far as to cook tree bark, pieces of leather from their own boots, and, in the darkest cases, the remains of horses that had fallen dead from the cold. Yes, they ate frozen meat from animals that had collapsed in the snow, and yet they were still hungry. Hunger made the men irritable, aggressive, and unstable. Small arguments turned into violent fights. Some soldiers hid food in their coats, and when others discovered it, it was like throwing fire on gunpowder. There were shoves, shouts, threats, until an officer arrived, too tired to intervene firmly, and simply ordered everyone back to their positions. But nothing was worse than seeing the wounded. Men with amputated hands, bandaged feet, faces burned by the cold, all waiting for food that never came. Some groaned for hot water, but the ice was so pervasive that even heating water became a battle. There were cases of soldiers fainting from sheer weakness, collapsing onto makeshift beds made of hard planks, covered with frozen blankets. And amidst all of this, a thought spread like poison. Germany has forgotten about them, or worse. Germany could no longer save them. Each day without food was a moral wound. Each empty stomach was a reminder that the dream of quick victory had turned into a slow, painful, inevitable nightmare. The officers tried to maintain discipline, but the truth was impossible to hide. There were no more sufficient supplies, no roads, no transportation. There was only snow, and men weaker and weaker, more and more desperate, fighting against the cold, against the enemy, and against their own bodies, which were beginning to give up. The transition from autumn to winter initially seemed like a relief, after weeks mired up to their knees in mud that swallowed boots, horses, and trucks. Many German soldiers believed that once the ground hardened, they would finally be able to advance more quickly. But that hope lasted only a few hours. As soon as the mud froze, it didn't turn into a road. It turned into irregular ice. The road was full of cracks, fissures, and natural traps created by the sudden freezing. Every step was a risk of twisting, fracturing, or falling. Every vehicle movement was a ticket to disaster. Trucks skidded, spun, and slid into deep ditches, and there was no way to get them out. The infantry detachments moved silently, not out of strategy, but out of exhaustion. The most common sound was no longer that of marching boots. It was the cracking of frozen joints and the chattering of teeth. Some men tied pieces of cloth or leather to the soles of their shoes to prevent slipping, but this only tore the fabric and left their feet even more exposed. Breath turned to vapor before it even fully left their mouths, creating small white clouds that betrayed their positions. And as the temperature dropped, everything changed. The smell, the sound, the very sensation of being alive. Even blood, when spilled, froze too quickly, leaving dark, hard stains on the floor like tiny ruby crystals. In one of the advanced platoons, a soldier slipped on a patch of ice, fell onto his rifle, and broke 2 ribs. They called for medical help. No. One came. They asked for a sled. There wasn't one. He lay there huddled up, shivering, waiting. And when they finally picked him up hours later, the skin on his face was so burned by the cold that it was peeling off in flakes. Winter was gaining ground without firing a single shot. Meanwhile, somewhere in the approaching white darkness, the Red Army watched, waited, and smiled silently. Shall we move forward? Just ask. At a certain point, the cold was no longer just discomfort, it was a predator. It didn't attack with speed, but with precision. Each gust of wind ripped heat from the body as if it had invisible claws. The skin stiffened, first white, then purple, and finally black. The men began to understand that death could come silently. The nights were the worst time. Inside the makeshift tents, if someone fell into a deep sleep, they risked never waking up again. Many soldiers began hitting their comrades in the early hours of the morning, not out of cruelty, but out of fear of seeing them freeze in their sleep. "Stay awake, stay awake," they repeated like a desperate mantra. Water no longer existed in liquid form. To drink, they scraped ice with bayonets and melted it inside ration cans, but the makeshift stove rarely worked. Gasoline froze, oil froze, weapons jammed because the lubricant turned into solid glue. To make them work, they had to remove all the oil and operate the metal completely dry, and even then, often the bolts simply wouldn't move. This created absurd situations. Men shooting and nothing happening. Click, silence. And then, with stiff fingers and excruciating pain shooting up their arms, they tried to unlock the mechanism while their breath turned to ice in their beards. The cold also altered the sound of war. Explosions seemed drier, gunshots echoed further, and the silence between attacks seemed eternal. In that silence, many soldiers heard something they hated to admit, her own heart beating too fast, trying to keep the body alive. One day, the temperature dropped to such an unimaginable level that even the wine froze inside the bottles. This became a bitter joke among the men. If even the wine froze, what will become of us? Nobody was really laughing, because there, in that white desert, everyone perceived the same cruel truth. They were fighting a war in which winter was always one step ahead and always exacting its price. The Russian winter of 1941-1942 was not merely cold. It was a living, conscious, vengeful entity that remembered every invader who had ever set foot on its soil. Napoleon, in 1812, had called that same cold General Winter. Now, 129 years later, the general returned more cruel than ever, as if he had learned from every French corpse frozen on the plains of Borodino and perfected his art of killing. The temperature plummeted every night to levels that challenged human existence itself. In Rzew, they recorded 53 degrees C. In Vyazma, 51 degrees C. On some nights near Kalinin, the mercury simply disappeared in the thermometer bulb. The cold was so absolute that the instruments gave way. The air wasn't just cold, it was dense, cutting, laden with ice crystals so fine they entered the lungs like razor blades. Soldiers reported that, upon inhaling deeply, they felt as if someone were sticking incandescent needles into their bronchi. The vapor from their breath froze instantly on their mustaches and eyebrows, forming heavy crusts that had to be broken off with their fingers. Fingers that no longer felt anything. The first to die were always the sentries. They stayed at their posts for 2 hours. Any longer was a death sentence. But even so, many were found at dawn as rigid as statues, rifles still on their shoulder, eyes wide open, staring into the white void. A corporal from the 7th Panzer Division wrote in his diary, later found frozen in his hand, "The cold enters through the mouth and descends to the soul. When I exhale, I feel I am losing a piece of myself that will never return." Gangrene began in the feet. The German 1939 model boots were made of thick leather with nailed soles, perfect for parades in Berlin, disastrous in Russia. The moisture from sweat froze inside them, forming blocks of ice that crushed the toes. When they tried to remove the boots at night in the shelters, holes dug in the snow covered with tarpaulins, the skin stuck to the leather. They ripped off the boot, and with it came the skin of the feet whole, like a red and white sock. The toes turned black in a few hours, then black and shiny, then they fell off on their own. A medic from the 98th Infantry Division amputated 47 feet in a single night, using a kitchen knife heated over a fire. There weren't enough serrated edges. The men screamed until they lost their voices, then just watched as their own toes were thrown into a pile that looked like charcoal. But the worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was the delirium of terminal hypothermia. When body temperature dropped below 30 degrees C, the body stopped shivering. The defense mechanism was exhausted. The soldier began to feel a wonderful, almost erotic warmth. He would take off his coat, his shirt, his helmet. He would lie down in the snow as if it were a bed of feathers. A sergeant major of the Totenkopf division was found completely naked, lying on his back, arms outstretched, with a frozen smile on his face and his penis erect, the last spasm of life betraying him in death. Another group of 8 men from the 161st Division was found forming a circle, all naked, embracing each other as if in a pagan orgy, serene faces, eyelashes covered in frost as delicate as confectioner's sugar. Even the horses suffered in a way that broke the hearts of the hardest soldiers. The divisional artillery animals neighed in pain all night long, stamping their hooves on the ground until they bled. By morning, they were frozen standing, their eyes burst open with frostbite, their muzzles covered in a mask of frozen blood, where they had tried to bite their own legs to ease the pain. Soldiers wept as they shot them, not out of pity for the animals, but because each dead horse meant a cannon that would no longer be fired. The weapons malfunctioned in ways that were almost comical, if they weren't tragic. German lubricating oil froze at 20 degrees C. Russian lubricating oil worked down to 60 degrees C. MG-34 machine guns jammed after 3 bursts. Kar 98K rifles needed to be warmed up over a fire before each shot. Egg grenades froze and didn't explode, or exploded in hands when the firing pin finally gave way. An entire platoon of the 45th Division died when they tried to warm grenades over a campfire. They all exploded at the same time. Food was another torment. Bread arrived frozen as a rock. Soldiers had to saw it open with bayonets and then place it inside their shirts against their chests to thaw with body heat. Heat that was already almost non-existent. Many lost teeth trying to bite bread as hard as iron. Canned meat froze in blocks. A can of Altaman, preserved meat and vegetables, had to be opened with an axe and heated directly over a fire until it became a charred paste on the outside and ice on the inside. Men ate snow to quench their thirst and died with their stomachs distended by blocks of ice. And amidst this slow, collective agony, the Soviet patrols, now reinforced by Siberian and Kazakh divisions, moved like wolves. They wore white camouflage over their padded telegraikas, felt valenki that made no noise in the snow, fox fur hats pulled up to their eyes. They used white skis. They glided between the trees like ghosts. They came so close they could hear the Germans crying inside the snow bunkers. A reconnaissance group from the 1st Guards Division slit the throats of 23 German sentries in a single night without firing a shot. They left the bodies sitting in the trenches, heads hanging forward as if they were sleeping. The next day, when the Germans discovered this, panic spread faster than any bullet. Other times, the Soviets simply waited. They knew the cold would do the work. They let the Germans bleed to death from minor wounds. A tiny cut on the finger would turn gangrene in 2 days. A captured and later shot Soviet prisoner laughed in the faces of the German interrogators. "You came to conquer Russia in winter. Russia doesn't need an army. It just needs to wait for you to freeze." The White Death was in no hurry. She whispered in each soldier's ear, "Sleep, sleep. I'll keep you warm." And when he slept, she took him away forever. On the other side of the line, in the dark forests beyond the Volga, on the frozen steppes of Siberia, in the smoking factories of the Urals, something primal was awakening. Stalin, after the paralyzing terror of June to October, had finally loosened the reins. Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Konev, Vatutin, all the generals he had nearly executed in the purges of 1937-38, now had carte blanche. Entire divisions were brought in from the far east. The 78th Siberian Division, the 316th Rifle Division of Panfilov, men who had grown up in temperatures of 60 degrees Celsius, who hunted bears with knives, who laughed when they saw Germans wrapped in blankets of stolen women. These Siberians arrived singing guttural tiger songs, beating their hairy chests, drinking vodka that didn't freeze because it was 70% alcohol. They brought PPSH-41 machine guns with 71-round round drums that fired even when covered in ice. They brought 30mm finish, knives that they used to cut throats or open cans with equal ease. They brought hatred, an ancient ancestral hatred that came from Genghis Khan, from Kutuzov from 1812, from 1917, and they brought tanks. Thousands of new T-34-76 tanks, painted white, with synthetic winter oil, wide tracks that floated on the snow like boats. KV-1s with armor that not even the German 75mm Paquet-40 cannon could scratch at less than 300 meters. American Studebaker and Ford trucks carrying Katyushas that fired 320 rockets in 10 seconds. From November 15 to December 4, the Soviets amassed 100,000 men, 7,500 cannons, 1,700 tanks and 2,500 aircraft in the Moscow sector alone, all hidden in the forests, camouflaged under white nets, their engines heated with braziers to prevent them from freezing. And then, on the night of December 5th to 6th, 1941, at 3 a.m., when the temperature was 47 degrees and the moon shone like a silver sheet in the sky, all hell broke loose. First came absolute silence, a silence so heavy it made your teeth ache. Then the ground began to tremble as if the earth itself were enraged. Thousands of T-34 tanks started their engines simultaneously, a roar muffled by the snow, but felt in the bones. Behind them, Siberian skiers with machine guns slung over their shoulders. Behind them still, ordinary infantry, including women, sharpshooters with wolf-like eyes, partisans with axes and grenades. At 5 a.m. the Katyushas sang. The sound was indescribable, a growing demonic howl, as if the gates of hell had opened and all the condemned souls were screaming at once. The rockets rose in red arcs, exploding in sequence, creating a wall of fire that advanced faster than any army. Each rocket raised columns of snow, frozen earth, pieces of German bodies, broken trees, all mixed together in a white and orange inferno. The Germans awoke to a real nightmare. Many were still sleeping, huddled together in groups of 3 or 4 to try and conserve heat, their bodies pressed against each other like animals. When they rushed to their positions barefoot because their boots were too stiff to put on in seconds, their feet froze in the snow within minutes. Machine guns jammed, cannons without recoil, hydraulics functioning, tanks with frozen diesel, engines that wouldn't turn over even with 20 men pulling the crank. In Istra, the 10th Panzer Division was caught sleeping. T-34s emerged from the snowstorm 50 meters away, their headlights off, only the glow of their cannons. They fired white dots, piercing German armor like a hot knife through butter. German crews tried to leave the hatches and were strafed in mid-air. A Soviet lieutenant climbed into a destroyed Panzer IV and urinated inside the turret while his men laughed. At Klin, Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. No, wait. Rommel was in Africa. It was the 7th Panzer, still called the Ghost Division, was surrounded in 48 hours. Survivors recounted that the Siberians advanced, singing without ducking, as if the German bullets were a fine rain. A giant, 2 meters tall with a frozen beard, carried a DP-28 machine gun on his shoulder as if it were a pistol and shouted, "Za Rodinu!" while mowing down an entire company. Near Tula, female partisans, not the night witches, those were pilots. They were ordinary partisans, led T-34 columns along forest trails that German maps didn't even dream existed. A 17-year-old girl named Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, captured and hanged days later, had already burned German stables and killed 20 horses before the offensive. The German prisoners were a pathetic sight. Men once proud of the Wehrmacht, now marching east with feet wrapped in rags, faces blackened by frostbite, eyes empty like holes. Many fell in the snow and were left there. The Soviet guards didn't even shoot unless they tried to escape. The cold took care of the rest. Zhukov attacked relentlessly, day and night. He used winter as a weapon. He ordered tanks to advance during snowstorms when visibility was zero. And the Germans didn't even suspect an attack. When the Germans tried to retreat, they found blown-up bridges, mined roads, forests full of snipers who killed officers at 800 meters with Mosin-Nagant rifles with telescopic sights. Hitler, in Rastenburg, shouted on the phone, "Not one step back." Guderian replied, "Mein Führer, my men are dying of cold, not Soviet bullets." Hitler dismissed him on the spot. Von Bock had a nervous breakdown. Von Kluge pleaded. Hübner disobeyed orders and retreated, saving what remained of the 4th Panzer Army. In January 1942, the Wehrmacht had lost 832,000 men since June, more than 300,000 in December-January alone, mostly to the cold. The Red Army, on the other hand, had achieved its first major victory. Winter did not help the Soviets. He was the Red Army. It was Russia itself, rising from the bloodied snow, opening its icy arms and screaming with the voice of 1,000,000 dead. "You came all the way here, now stay here, forever." When the Soviet offensive of December 1941 finally exploded, it wasn't just the front line that crumbled first, it was everything behind it. The Wehrmacht, that machine that had cut across Europe like a hot blade through butter, began to rot from the inside out, like an infected body poisoned by its own blood. Winter didn't just freeze the men in the trenches, it froze the very idea of an army, transforming proud divisions into hordes of hungry, desperate, crazed ghosts. The roads, those same dusty roads that, in June, had been called Autobahns to Moscow by Goebbels's propagandists, were now mass graves of steel and rubber. Thousands of captured French Opel Blitz trucks, Ford V3000s, Renaults, Italian Lancia vans, all lay abandoned in endless rows, hoods open like mouths screaming at the grey sky. German diesel, unsuitable for the Russian cold, had turned to a brown jelly inside the tanks. The engines, when they tried to start them, simply cracked their cylinder blocks with dry pops that echoed like gunshots. Tires burst during the night, exploding with bangs that made the sentries think the partisans were attacking. A single 40-kilometer stretch between Vyazma and Yukhnov had more than 2,800 abandoned vehicles. A double, sometimes triple, row of carcasses blocking everything. The soldiers called it the truck cemetery, and that's exactly what it was. Without transport, supplies never arrived. Armored trains stopped hundreds of kilometers away, their tracks blown up by partisans or simply frozen on. The rails, the last convoys that managed to advance, carried useless cargo, summer uniforms, ammunition for captured French cannons that no one used anymore, letters from home that froze before being read. A depot in Reshchev held 40,000 pairs of summer boots, perfect for the Libyan desert, ridiculous there. Meanwhile, the men at the front wrapped their feet in Völkische Beobachter newspapers stolen from latrines, or cut pieces of horse blankets to make makeshift boots that lasted 2 days before falling apart. The food became legendary. What arrived was frozen so solid it had to be chopped with an axe. A can of Erbswurst, pea sausage, would turn into a cylinder of ice that, when heated over a fire, would explode and scatter shards of hot metal. Soldiers fought like dogs for a single can of captured Hungarian meat, some even killing for it. In some sectors, officers had to mount armed guards around food depots to prevent their own men from looting. A Hauptmann of the 18th Panzer Division was lynched by his soldiers when they discovered he was hiding 2 boxes of Swiss chocolate in his personal truck. They found his body with his face buried in the snow, his mouth still full of chocolate, half melted by the heat of his blood. The wounded were the worst. The ambulances had disappeared, turned into fuel for bonfires or makeshift shelters. The slightly wounded were left behind with a bottle of schnapps and a revolver with 1 bullet. The seriously wounded were simply abandoned on the roads, wrapped in tarpaulins, moaning softly so as not to waste energy. A field hospital near Kalinin had 200 wounded when the Soviets arrived. Only 47 survived. The others froze on the stretchers, blood from amputations turning into red crystals in the snow. Many asked for Genickschuss, a shot to the back of the head, and many comrades gave it. A young lieutenant in the Spanish Blue Division wrote before killing himself, "I prefer a bullet in the head to 1,000 needles in my body." Communication died. Telephone cables froze and snapped like glass threads. Enigma radios needed batteries that lasted 20 minutes in the cold before dying. Messengers on BMW or Zundap motorcycles slipped on the road and broke their necks. Others were captured by partisans and found days later with their eyes gouged out and ears cut off. A regimental commander only discovered that his left flank had been annihilated when a bloodied, staggering soldier arrived saying, "Herr Oberst, they're behind us now." Behind, the most feared word of the entire war. The retreat, when finally authorized too late, turned into carnage. Entire divisions received conflicting orders. Hitler shouted, "Stellung halten bis zum letzten Mann," while generals on the ground begged permission to retreat 10 kilometers. When permission came, it was total chaos. 10 divisions tried to use the same narrow road at the same time, at night, in snowstorms of 45 degrees Celsius. Tanks crushed trucks to get through. Infantry climbed onto tanks to avoid being left behind, freezing atop the turrets like grotesque statues. In a single night between Gzhatsk and Vyazma, more than 18,000 men froze trying to get around a traffic jam. They veered into the open field and sank into the snow up to their waists, then up to their chests, then lay down and never got up again. Discipline, that Prussian discipline that made the Wehrmacht feared, evaporated like breath in the freezing air. Soldiers shot at officers who tried to keep them in. And position. Officers tore the silver insignia from their shoulders and mingled with the common soldiers to avoid being the first to die. Entire platoons deserted, raiding burned villages in search of frozen potatoes on the ground or vodka hidden in wells. Some formed gangs, veritable straggler gangs that looted German depots, killing guards if necessary. In Arshev, a group of 400 men from the 161st Infantry Division entrenched themselves in a ruined church, refusing to come out even under threat of court-martial. When the next regiment passed by days later, they found only frozen bodies in seated positions, weapons in their laps, eyes open. They had died sleeping, embraced by one another. There were cases of cannibalism, first whispers, then suppressed official reports. Soldiers cutting off pieces of the buttocks of dead comrades. Buttocks freeze last, the rumor went. A doctor from the 206th Division wrote in a report that was destroyed. "We found bodies without thighs, without arms. The cuts were clean, knife or bayonet. It wasn't the Russians." Meanwhile, in the shadows of the forests, partisans emerged like crows. Women, old women with scythes, teenagers with gasoline canisters, former gulag prisoners with hatred to spare. They didn't need to fight, just wait. They cut lines, burned depots, killed stragglers. A column of 800 lightly wounded was found intact, throats cut, bodies arranged in a circle with a sign in German, "Welcome to Russia, make yourselves at home." The German machine was not being defeated only by the T-34s or the Katyushas. She was being devoured alive by her own rotting body. Panic was as contagious as lice. A single rumor, "The Russians are in the rear," was enough for an entire division to abandon positions and run. Run where? Nobody knew, only backward, away from the roar of the Soviet tanks that were now coming not only from the front, but from all sides. By February 1942, what remained of the Heeresgruppe Mitte was no longer an army. It was a multitude of human rags dragging themselves westward, leaving behind an 800-kilometer trail of white graves. The collapse didn't come with fanfare. It came in silence, with the sound of frozen boots breaking, with the snap of fingers falling on the snow, with the last breath of an officer who, before freezing to death, wrote in the snow with blood from his own lungs, "We are lost. We're lost." And we really were. When the order to retreat finally arrived, delayed, confused, often shouted by officers, with voices hoarse from exhaustion and fear, There was no longer an army to retreat. There was only a broken human mass, a procession of spectres dragging themselves westward as if hell itself was spitting them back home. The word Rückzug sounded almost comical on the lips of the commanders. Retreat? That wasn't a retreat. It was a stampede. It was collective panic. It was the end of the world disguised as a tactical movement. The columns formed haphazardly, without marching order, without a defined vanguard or rear guard. Entire divisions mingled, men from the 3rd Panzer Division with riflemen from the 258th Infantry, grenadiers from the Großdeutschland with Austrian cooks and Romanian drivers. No one wore any more divisional insignia. All were just grey and white rags covered in snow, frozen mud and dried blood. They marched in silence because speaking consumed energy, and energy was the only currency left. Their feet were the worst. Those who still had boots dragged them like lead balls, cracked soles, leather hardened like iron. Many had abandoned them days before because the weight was unbearable. They walked with stolen flour sacks tied to their feet, or newspapers stuffed inside their trousers, or simply barefoot, leaving red footprints in the snow that froze in seconds. With each step, the flesh tore a little more. Frostbite blisters burst, pus froze, toes turned black and fell into makeshift bandages like clumps of coal. A soldier from the 12th Infantry Division wrote on a piece of cardboard before he died, "My feet are no longer mine. They are 2 blocks of ice dragging me to the grave." When someone fell, nobody stopped them. To stop meant to die. A man was stumbling, kneeling, trying to get up. Others passed over him or beside him, their eyes fixed on the white horizon. Sometimes a close friend would reach out, but the hand trembled so much he couldn't grasp it. After a few seconds, the fallen man would let out a low groan, almost a sigh of relief, and turn his face to the snow. Within minutes, he was stiff. Hours later, he was just another marker on the road, a pile of cloth with a helmet on top, or no helmet, because someone passing by later needed it more. The road, if it could still be called that, was a death corridor. From Vyazma to Smolensk, from Rzhev to Gzhatsk, the path was littered with bodies in impossible positions, one sitting against a tree, head hanging like a broken puppet, another face down, arms outstretched as if still, trying to crawl. Entire groups huddled together in circles, as if trying to share the last warmth before the end. There were women too. Nurses, radio assistants, field prostitutes who followed the regiments, frozen with their hair loose and covered in frost, mouths open in silent screams. Dead horses swelled and then withered from the cold, bellies exploded by the gas of frozen decomposition, eyes burst like frozen grapes. Abandoned Tiger tanks with open turrets, crew still inside, frozen in. Positions of those who tried to escape and couldn't, one with its head sticking out, tongue black with cold, hanging like dry leather. Vehicles formed insurmountable walls. Trucks burned to keep the men warm at night were now just black skeletons. A Panzer IV lay on its side, its tracks broken with a body hanging from the hatch. The commander who hanged himself with his own belt to avoid capture. Another Opel Blitz truck had its doors open, and inside sat 8 men in a circle, all dead, their hands still clutching a bottle of schnapps frozen in the middle of a final toast, and behind them came the Red Army, not as an army, but as vengeance incarnate. T-34s appeared out of nowhere in the snowstorm, their headlights off, firing on the moving columns. A burst from a Degtyaryov machine gun swept away 20 men at once, bodies falling like rag dolls. Cossacks on low, sturdy horses galloped down the flanks, curved sabres gleaming under the moon, cutting off the heads of stragglers as if harvesting wheat. Siberian snipers, wrapped in white camouflage, killed officers from 600 meters away. A flash in the forest, an officer falling with a perfect hole in his forehead, and the entire column went into blind panic. Partisans emerged from the forests like wolves. A column of 3,000 men near Yukhnov was attacked at night. Grenades thrown at the trucks, fire in the makeshift tents, throats cut while they slept. By morning, Only 400 remained alive, and those 400 marched faster, leaving the wounded screaming in the snow. A 15-year-old partisan girl was seen by survivors. She threw bottles of gasoline at the wounded and laughed as they burned alive, a fast blue fire that melted the surrounding snow into red puddles. The nights were the true tribunal. When the sun disappeared, if it ever appeared, the temperature dropped to 50 degrees 6. The men dug holes in the snow with helmets, bayonets, and bare hands until their bones were exposed. They entered in groups of 5, 6, 10 bodies, pressed together like animals. They trembled so much that the entire hole vibrated. They prayed in hushed voices, Catholics, Protestants, atheists, all together. Some urinated in their trousers to gain a few minutes of warmth. Others defecated right there, because coming out meant certain death. In the morning, there were always one or two who didn't wake up, their bodies rigid, eyes open, staring at the black sky. The survivors had to break the dead man's arms to pull him out of the hole, because the embrace of death was the strongest of all. Hunger was turning men into animals. Rations had long since run out. They ate leather from belts boiled in the snow. They tore the soles off dead boots and chewed them like gum. They cut chunks of meat from dead horses, raw meat, frozen meat, eaten with crystallized blood. In some sectors, the rumors became reality. Soldiers cutting off the buttocks of recently deceased comrades, cooking them over tiny fires. An officer of the 78th Division was shot, dead by his own men when he tried to stop them from cutting chunks out of a frozen cable. The official report said, "Killed in action." Everyone knew the truth. There were those who went mad. A lieutenant in the Spanish Blue Division walked around naked from the waist down, shouting that it was hot, that he saw palm trees. They shot him out of pity. Another group of Hungarians from the Second Army sang Christmas carols as they marched, until the Cossacks appeared and silenced their voices forever. The columns dwindled by the hour. Of the 40,000 men who had emerged from one pocket, only 8,000 arrived. Of the 15,000, only 2,000 arrived. Some simply sat in the snow and waited. A soldier from the 45th Division was found days later still alive, sitting against a burned-out tank, his legs amputated by the cold up to his knees, smoking an imaginary cigarette, smiling at nothing. They weren't backing down. They were being hunted. They were being erased. With each kilometer to the west, they left, behind not only conquered territories, but pieces of themselves in the snow. A finger here, an ear there, a frozen eye further on, a whole soul with every step. When some finally reached the German lines, those few, those damned lucky ones, they were no longer men. They were shells, deep-set eyes, frostbite black faces, lipless mouths, nameless souls. They looked at the newcomers from the train with an expression that was colder than winter. Don't you understand yet? Russia doesn't let anyone leave alive, and the snow continued to fall, silent, patient, cover everything, forever. There came a point in the retreat where no one knew where he was going, or how far the next defensive line was. The only thing everyone knew with absolute certainty was that to stop meant to die. And it was on one of those endless nights that the situation reached such a brutal point that many soldiers were never able to talk about it afterward. The snow fell without stopping, thick, heavy, silent. It covered trails, bodies, weapons, tracks, everything. It was as if winter were erasing the human presence from that place. The men walked hunched over, almost on all fours, fighting against the wind that pushed against their backs like the hands of an invisible giant. When they tried to breathe, they felt ice crystals forming inside their noses. Some drew blood when they tried to blow their noses. Many simply kept their heads down and continued step by step, like broken machines. And then something worse happened. The column split, not out of strategy, but out of desperation. At a snow-covered crossroads, officers shouted conflicting orders, pointing in opposite directions. Some maps were blurred, others were already useless. Visibility was almost zero, And so little by little, entire groups got lost. Each group believed they were on the right track. Each group unknowingly is walking towards a nightmare. Those who headed for the frozen swamp didn't stand a chance. The surface seemed solid, white and firm, but beneath it lay icy water, hidden like a sleeping monster. When the first soldier passed, nothing happened. When the second did as well, everything seemed safe. But in the middle of the crossing, the ice cracked, a dry sound, then another one, and then the ground sank. Men, horses, and equipment were swallowed by the dark, bubbling water that seemed alive. They screamed, struggled, tried to climb up, but their heavy, frozen clothing pulled everything down. The ice began to close again while some still fought to emerge. Those nearby tried to pull their comrades away by the collar, the arm, the rifle, until their own frozen fingers could hold on any longer. Many soldiers were swallowed up there, without shots fired, without enemies, without glory, just for winter, through silence, through the black water beneath the ice. Those who managed to escape now had a different perspective. It wasn't fear anymore. It was a kind of emptiness, a weariness so profound it seemed to kill emotions. Some walked around soaking wet, each drop turning to ice on their bodies. Within minutes, they were as rigid as walking statues. Others threw themselves into abandoned barns and lit desperate fires, burning maps, boxes, even pieces of furniture, anything to dry clothes before the cold took its final toll. That night marked the line between soldiers and survivors, because from that point on, nobody thought about victory, honor, or mission anymore. They only thought about one thing: to arrive at dawn with your heart still beating. After that terrible night, the German advance was over. The retreat was over. What remained was a long line of scattered men, each group following its own instincts like wounded animals, trying to find shelter before the final storm. It was in this scenario of complete disorder that the so-called ice wanderers, soldiers who had lost units, weapons, maps, officers, and, in many cases, their very sense of where they were. They were men wandering aimlessly, guided only by the fragile warmth that remained in their hearts. They moved like spectres in the snow. Their beards were covered in ice. Their coats were stiff as metal. Their eyes were sunken, red, and burned by the wind. Some walked with pieces of blanket tied to their faces. Others held weapons that no longer worked, but which served as makeshift walking sticks. At times, they looked like shadows gliding across the white field. Shadows, and nothing more. Hunger has reached unimaginable levels. The last rations had disappeared days before, or weeks, depending on who you asked. Hunger made the mind delirious. Some soldiers swore they had seen villages, bonfires, entire columns marching, only to discover they were mirages, distorted reflections of the moon on the snow. Without food, they began to scavenge every destroyed farm, every barn, every abandoned house. They found frozen flour, half an onion, as hard as a rock, and pieces of charcoal. Everything was eaten, everything was chewed, everything was swallowed, and sometimes they found nothing. The worst part was when they found frozen bodies, sometimes civilians, sometimes soldiers, sometimes from companions. These bodies were covered in snow like wax statues. Some vagrants took off their gloves, picked up their watches, letters, lighters, medals, anything that could be traded later. Others simply stared in such profound silence that it seemed to kill a little more of their soul. The war there no longer had sides. It no longer had a flag. It no longer had any glory. It was simply survival, brutal, animalistic, instinctive. And then came the worst part. The Red Army began hunting down the vagrants. Soviet patrols crossed the icy fields on skis, silent as ghosts. When they saw a group of disorganized German soldiers, without useful weapons, without formation, they didn't hesitate. Bursts of machine gun fire cut through the silence like blades. Grenades lit up the night like tiny suns, and the snow absorbed everything. Blood, pieces, screams. Some vagrants ran, others threw themselves to the ground, others simply stood still, too exhausted to try to escape. The Soviets were not fighting an army at that point. They were eliminating fleeing survivors, and the survivors were just trying to stay alive for another day. Each step became slower, each kilometer gets longer, each night more deadly. Germany still called that a strategic retreat. But for those who were there, for those who felt the ice corroding their flesh, it was the end, dragging on in slow motion. The men who finally reached the furthest rear lines were no longer soldiers of the glorious army that had crossed Europe in 1941. They were tattered coats, trembling figures, living shadows that still breathed. Out of stubbornness, instinct, perhaps by miracle, when they began to appear, shuffling their feet, barely recognizable, the officers who received them fell, silent. No motivational speech could hide the truth that was approaching with the force of an avalanche. Germany had underestimated the Russian winter, and now it was paying with flesh, bones, and souls. What's left of them? Men who had walked for days without sleep, men who had burned photos, manuals, and even furniture to survive the night, men who had lost fingers, noses, parts of their faces to the cold, men trembling uncontrollably, trapped between fever and delirium, men who didn't speak, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't anymore. Some arrived carrying dead companions on their shoulders, as if they hadn't yet realized that the weight had stopped breathing hours ago. Others came alone, staring into the void, repeating the names of destroyed cities, lost companions, family members they might never see again. Shattered, silenced by the ice, before men even realized it. And on the white plains, beneath the biting wind, the Eastern Front whispered the truth that would echo forever. Beneath the ice, beyond salvation, Germany's collapse had begun. The doctors were trying to save the soldiers, but nothing could be done when they arrived with black feet, stiff ears, and eyes burned by the cold. The phrase most often heard was, "It's too late." The heated tents weren't for healing, they were only there to offer those last few minutes of comfort. There, the brutal truth dawned on them. It wasn't the end of a battle. It was the end of the illusion of a quick victory. The army that had marched confidently eastward was now destroyed by winter itself, broken, exhausted, and bleeding without a decisive battle. While a few survivors tried to rebuild their lives, a silent question hung in the air. If winter alone did this to the Wehrmacht, what will happen when the Soviets come in full force? The answer would come in the following years, in battles that would go down in history. But in that frozen moment, everyone already knew. The German march had not been interrupted, it had been destroyed.